welcome to our panel discussion, Metrics That Matter. I'll start with a quick intro to myself and Cord, and then we'll get straight into the meat of it with our panelists. So I'm Tom, I'm the CPO at Cord. I've been at Cord pretty much since we founded, which was about 7 years ago, and I'll be hosting the discussion today. Very quick pitch on Cord for people who haven't used it or heard of us before. We're the hiring tool used by internal teams at big names you might recognize, like Starling Bank, AWS, The Economist, but also thousands of smaller growing tech startups to make hires into their tech product, data, and commercial teams. We provide companies with direct access to quality, responsive candidates who are open to work and help companies significantly reduce their time spent hiring and their cost per hire. So with that out of the way, onto the webinar. Today we're covering the topic of recruitment metrics. We think this topic is important because all talent teams aspire to and see the importance of being data-led. But as a company grows, priorities change, tracking metrics becomes hard, and using the data effectively is even harder. Even though which metrics to just care about can be a real challenge. So we have our industry experts here, Luke, Mike, and Rakeem, and we're going to try and answer questions of what metrics should you care about and how can you think about them. We'll then work through some specific topics to learn how we can use these metrics to increase stakeholder buy-in, improve candidate experience, and how we can apply them in DE&I initiatives as well. As we talk through this, we would love to hear from you too. So there's two ways that you guys can interact. The first is on the right-hand side, we have a poll, which I'll just quickly add to the stream here. It would be great to understand a bit more about what recruitment metrics you guys are considering as the most important. As we go through this, it might help us guide the discussion slightly. And then the second thing is, you'll notice on the right-hand side of the screen, we've got the Q&A, where you guys can ask questions as we go through. If the question is relevant to the topic we're currently speaking about, we'll try and answer it there and then. If it's not, we'll make sure that we leave some time for a Q&A at the end. So if I can work out how to just get rid of that, there we go. Let's meet the panelists. So if you guys wouldn't mind just quickly introducing yourself, Luke, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name's Luke, and been recruiting for about 13, 14 years. But the past 8 years or so, my role has been to embed into hyperscaling tech companies, usually going through a significant period of change through venture capital funding or some such. And my role has been to embed in some form of leader, set up the tools, processes, systems, and best practices needed for them to scale, and just make sure that people and talent isn't a bottleneck or a blocker to that company's investment milestones. And then I swan off and do that with another company, which is lots of fun. So does that make me like the Mary Poppins of TA? Not for me to say, but probably, yeah. So I'm pretty much the Mary Poppins of TA.
Well, Mary, great to have you. Mike, we'll go over to you next.
Yeah, thanks. Good afternoon. I'm Mike Bradshaw. I'm the head of talent at Pinpoint. We're a UK-based applicant tracking system, but with a global customer base. I've been in TA recruiting for about 15 years, and the last 8 years really focused on pre-seed and Series A startups coming in as sort of the first talent hire and building functions from scratch.
Awesome. Great to have you, Mike. And Rak, over to you.
Thank you. So I'm Rak. I head up the account management team here at Zinc. Zinc's on a mission to make background checking delightful. So that is global checks that are easy and instant, but more importantly, we impress both recruiters and candidates with their experience. So I've been with Zinc just for over 2.5 years now.
Awesome. Cheers, Rak. So let's get into it. So I think the first question I'm going to ask is a broad one. How should recruitment teams think about metrics, and which metrics should they care about? Mike, we'll go over to you first on that one, if that's okay.
Yeah. When it comes to recruiting metrics, I always like to start with the end in mind when entering an organization, asking myself, what does an ideal recruiting function look like for the specific organization? What does the team care about? What do the hiring managers care about? What does senior leadership care about? And from there, I'm going to consider aspects like candidate experience, hiring manager satisfaction, quality of hire, efficiency, fairness, and then, of course, ultimately business impact. But it's important to know that different stakeholders are going to care about different things, and understanding that will allow you to translate key information better. And so for leadership teams specifically, They need data that's going to help them solve future problems. They need to know the strength of their team, what's enabling or blocking you from finding great people, hopefully how to find more people the same caliber that you're hiring, and how ultimately recruiting, hiring moves the business towards its strategic goals. I think once you've identified what's important, you want to determine how to measure those factors efficiently. So in my role, I may look at 10 to 15 metrics at a given time, but when communicating with hiring managers or senior leadership, I'll focus on 1 or 2 data points that are really relevant to them. Your ATS should be able to provide you instant insights, as well as the flexibility to make custom reports that will ultimately align and enable you to have those conversations. But ultimately, the key is to identify what's important to the company, establish how to track and measure, determine who needs visibility into those metrics. And this will hopefully ensure that your data is both actionable and comprehensive.
Awesome. Cheers, Mike. And to maybe drill into that a little bit more, I'd be curious to know, like, in your current position at Pinpoint, how have you gone about defining like which metrics the team should really care about in any moment, and which ones have you landed on as well?
Yeah, it's really understanding. So taking the time to sort of list it. When I joined the organization, I came in with sort of assumption based on my past experience, based on the size of the company and the industry that we're in. So I have those. I'll look at historical data, see what's sort of gone well, what's not, what they've maybe tracked and cared about. But really, it's about listening those first sort of 90 days, understanding what the business objectives are, how the hiring managers are talking about their people, how they talk about filling recs, and you're sort of pairing all that information, how they sort of perceive a successful talent function, your experience, and then the sort of data, and mirroring that together. It may mean taking them sort of on a journey around like, here's where you define what success looks like. Here's where we think we can move the needle, and here's how we define that. And here's the number. Here's why we drive towards that. So it's really that sort of process within those first 90 days and then establishing those metrics, and then really picking your spots as to when and how you talk about data. And again, not overloading people with the 15 metrics that I may look at and care about, the sort of 1 or 2 like headlines, and then showing what we've sort of put into place. Did I ask for this new ATS, this new background check tool, whatever it might be? And here's how we've sort of impacted with those asks. Our time to hire has gone down. This means we have put this person in seat sooner. And this is what it means for CS, that we are sort of ahead of our accounts. So really understanding that and then translating that and taking them on that journey, and then being really clear with those metrics when you talk through them.
Awesome. Yeah, Luke, I can see you nodding away. So maybe we'll come over to you next. I know you've got a kind of like framework for the way that you can think about understanding recruitment metrics. So it'd be great to hear a bit more about your experience there and how you describe that.
Yeah, first of all, I could just say what Mike said, and it'd be just as valuable. It's a nail on the head for me with a lot of core points. Yeah, I mean, just to sort of bounce off one of Mike's points there, just to follow on from that, like the idea of you have to put recruitment data in the context of the wider business goal, rather than an arbitrary or assumed hiring target, for instance. If you don't do that, you can't really say that TA is strategically aligned to the business. It is a service function. If it's a hiring target that has been given to you by leadership, and then recruitment then goes about fulfilling that hiring target, that's not a strategic function. So I think the first thing you have to do is ensure that talent acquisition and talent acquisition knowledge is being used to marry recruitment data to a business goal. So the business goal is to, I don't know, achieve a certain amount of investment, or to, even if it's to grow, well, what does that mean, grow? It doesn't necessarily have to mean headcount. It could mean a location, or it could mean, market share or whatever. So recruiters have to be at the table when it comes to workforce planning, and TA has to be part of wider the cycle of sort of financial workforce planning before you get to just an arbitrary number of hires that recruiters have to go and then away. So number one, the metrics have to be aligned to the business goal, and if they're not, there's potential risk that recruiters go ahead and make all those hires, and at the end of the year, the business goal hasn't been served, and that's when you get things like redundancy and all the sort of the ugly stuff that we've seen compounded in organizations like Neta and so on. So that's number one. So I think that's a good point, Mike, that you made around the business goal. In terms of recruitment data, like what should you be caring about? I try to stay away from North Star metrics because they're so interconnected. Someone actually asked me 2 weeks ago if there was only one recruitment metric that you could use what would it be and why? And I remember at the back of my head thinking, what an awful question. I didn't say that to their face, obviously. But I remember thinking, well, what a silly question. That's like saying, if you had to write an email, you only had one key on your keyboard, what key would it be? It's like, well, the answer is get a new keyboard, right? You can't write
my next question.
Yeah, exactly, right. So in terms of what you should measure, just understand that all your metrics are interconnected. So even if there was one North Star metric like number of hires, well, is it fundamental? What if it was $1 million a hire? Not very fundamental now, is it? All right, what about cost per hire? All right, well, what if probation pass rate was 4%? Well, not very fundamental metric now, is it? You know, they're absolutely interconnected. So if you're not aligned to the business goal and you don't understand sort of how the metrics relate to each other, then you kind of flying blind. So think about, I don't want to be too high level with my speech, but rather than think about North Stars, think about constellations. Like, how do they all relate to each other? That's how you navigate. When it comes to the actual nuts and bolts of what you kind of need to be measuring, or what will be valuable to measure, you know, first of all, you've obviously got an awesome ATS like Pinpoint. I'm sure you can pull out lots of qualitative data or end state data very easily. So what is everything you've wanted to learn about an offer? So if every role in a database was an offer, every column is something you want to learn about that offer. So you should be able to pull out all of that as end state data. So, you know, you can figure out the time to hire and the status of an offer and so on. That's relatively easy data to pull out and be able to visualize and aggregate with a small amount of effort. But also quantitative metrics is something that I think is very, very inconsistent across businesses. So some recruiters and some recruitment teams may measure volume, how much of X have I done per week, and sometimes maybe conversion, right? How does the pass through relate to the efficiency of our process? But if you look at any process funnel outside of recruitment, this isn't new stuff, right? They've been using this type of data to make every process efficient, car manufacturing, software development, and so on. One of the main metrics that isn't being measured that should be in that quantitative sort of field is capacity. And the reason capacity is quite important is that all bottlenecks are capacity problems. And we as recruiters tend to either misunderstand bottlenecks or use a colloquial term to mean difficulty. But in actual fact, the bottleneck is a very specific meaning in a process, which is something where the volume outstrips the capacity in a certain stage within a certain point. And from that, you can make very sophisticated calculations from just those three measurements: volume, conversion, and capacity. So I think one of the things that's really beneficial to business to measure is volume, conversion, and capacity, because with that, they can create like a lean process funnel. And from there, that's a good objective basis for them to start continuous improvement with their business and figuring out how to translate that into level of effort, money, time for stakeholders, and so on, and how to generate rituals of continuous improvement to say, right, well, we'll make this improvement in this quarter, and it should net us this many engineering hours back, for instance. So I would say some of the most fundamental metrics to measure in recruitment aren't easy to measure because workflows and ATSs can be complex, but it's something that scales. So an individual recruiter can do that with a spreadsheet, or the head of TA for a large business can do it across the whole business. It does scale. So that's kind of where I'd recommend that's some of the metrics that I think you should care about, because it is so versatile. It's much more sophisticated than a lot of other TA metrics, and it allows you to spot bottlenecks, which can cost millions if not measured correctly.
Awesome. Yeah. Cheers, Luke. And I think that's a great way to think about it, because it's not saying there is a one size fits all for every business in terms of metrics, but what actually can work for business is setting up a way to measure this volume, focus, and capacity, and work out the things that you can do to improve where you're at. Luke, well, we were speaking before this. You gave an example, actually, I think maybe from Klarna, of how you kind of applied this and how it exposed a bottleneck that ultimately you were able to then improve the outcomes quite significantly. It might be worth just mentioning that to give people a bit more kind of context on how this can be applied. Yeah,
sure. It can relate to candidate experience and a few other things as well. So when we're in Klarna, I was in Klarna in this sort of pre-IPO phase, and they were making in excess of like 2,000 plus engineering hires globally in a year, like, you know, significant amount of hiring. So in this large process, we there was a certain drop-off rate. There was a high cost per hire, and there was a drop-off rate at the technical interview stage of, I think it was about 44% pass-through rate at technical. And the assumption was that, well, we have a fantastic engineering culture. The recruitment team obviously isn't technical enough to find the best candidates, and they're all failing at this stage. So that was the assumption based on just that pure looking at the conversion. When we actually dug into it and I looked across the domains globally, and we looked at what capacity they have, and we looked at maybe evidences of bottlenecks, i.e. like wait times, like a queue behind a certain stage, what we realized is that there was a significant vicious cycle in a bottleneck that has gone on for a significant amount of time, which was causing this drop off. So for instance, essentially on average, they had in a week about 4 slots to do a technical interview, and the recruitment team was putting in on average 6+ candidates in that stage. So think about what this means for your recruitment process. In a week, you fill that up, and then there's 2 other candidates that need to be put in maybe into the following week. The following week, what is your effective capacity then? It's 2, because 2 people filled up those slots. So then you put in 2 people and then another 4 for the following week. Well, what happens to the wait time just for an interview, not for the whole process, for every single candidate in that process globally? The whole process, the whole time in stage goes up by a week. So that's what happened. I think it was every 4 weeks, the time in stage went up by 2 weeks. So we had candidates waiting on average 5 to 6 weeks for a technical interview. So what do you think happened to the drop-off rate of candidates? What happens to candidate experience if I wanted the total time to offer to be 28 days, no more, and if we were waiting sort of 4 to 6 weeks just for an interview? Well, of course, it drops. So what we saw was a very significant bottleneck. Now, it's worth mentioning that the potential solutions to those problems before we measured capacity were recruiters aren't doing enough. How can we get more volume? How can we get more people into this funnel? Which of course would make the problem worse, because you're going to have more people in the queue. What do you need? You need more level of effort to make the same number of hires, and round it goes. So cost per hire was up, time in stage was up, and of course the level of effort to make hires was mad. And the proposed solutions was RPOs and more recruiters, which would have cost more money. So what we did was we realized that this was a bottleneck. I had to go to the CTO and actually say, in order to make more hires, we need to do less recruitment, which is a very strange thing to say to someone. And if you don't have data at your back, very short conversation, right? Fundamentally, what we had to do is increase the capacity. So we had at least 6 in each sort of domain. This was global, 6 slots to meet the volume. And until we've actually trained the interviewers so it can be done in a consistent and compliant manner, we throttled the volume by increasing, doing more DE&I pieces, that naturally throttle volume, but would also increase the quality of the hire because it achieved other business goals, and looking for people in specific competing organizations and things like this. So we throttle the volume to meet capacity, so that way every recruiter was doing the most efficient work. And then when the capacity came up, we could ramp the volume back up again. Now, we calculated at the end of the time that we had with Klarna over about 3 years, that we made about an additional 350 to 500 hires when we modeled it out, had we not done that. And we saved them in excess of about €2 million, just an operational cost, because the cost per hire obviously comes down. The actual pass-through rate at the tech stage was up sort of high 60s, something like that. So I don't want to occupy too much of this webinar with just that one example, but that gives you a clear example of how not measuring capacity can have a pretty significant impact on a growing business. It doesn't just have to be high volume; it could be a smaller business, and bottlenecks could be anywhere, right? It could be in your recruitment function, it could be in your offer stage, or it could be your onboarding process.
Great, thanks for sharing that, Luke. I think that really does help, especially when you see something that, sometimes you work in a smaller company, it's hard to really recognize the impact that these bottleneck changes can make. But when you're doing that at scale, it kind of like, it all plays out, doesn't it? And then you can look at the end and say that. So I think it'd be really useful for anyone in the audience who's working in a smaller company wondering, okay, how important actually is this kind of like finding these bottlenecks, removing them, to see what that actually means when you implement it. Rak, I'll come to you next, kind of to go back to the original question. So how do you think recruitment teams should think about metrics, and which metrics should they care about? I guess you come at this from a interesting perspective in that from Zinc's point of view, you look at a certain part of this process. So it'd be really interesting to hear a bit more about that as well.
Sure, I guess, well, going for the journey at Zinc, obviously we've grown quite quickly. So we've kind of quickly understood that sort of metrics should go beyond just the numbers. And things that we think are really important when sort of considering metrics is things like quality of hire, but more importantly, how they align with organizational culture and values, and sort of the short-term impacts of measuring both of these. So I think what was really interesting was when I spoke to Tom, our sort of VP of customer, who's been a head of people before, who explained historically how they've tried to test candidates for alignment with company values and cultural fit now. And that's just as important as and then crucial skills, right? But it's quite difficult to measure directly. So one metric that he's sort of quite passionate about is something that he calls preventable churn within 6 months. So this highlights sort of whether a hire was like misaligned and indicates any issues that recruitment teams can address, really. So one thing that really came out of that was sort of drop-off rates, and even sort of roles where there was time sensitive in terms of getting them in the business quicker. A common problem was sort of poorly designed roles, maybe, where sort of we saw maybe a bit of higher churn in those roles, where you maybe rush the process, rush the sort of the creation of that role design. So analyzing data like drop-off rates and even that preventable churn sort of really helps you redefine sort of the job design and ensures that candidates understood the role. And of course, that ultimately leads to better retention. And another metric that for more perfect Zinc can help with sort of in the more onboarding side is sort of recruiters can sort of track risk mitigation. So of course, with background screening, we sort of look to mitigate reputational risks, right? So through tools like Zinc, platforms can sort of help you identify sort of what risks you mitigated. And also recruiters can take a bit of pride knowing they've reduced business risks by looking at those sort of metrics as well.
Great, cheers, Rack. So we've got a kind of like spectrum of stuff that we've spoken about there. I guess firstly, I guess finding metrics that align with business goals, then how you can think about things in terms of like a volume process, capacity framework to help you spot bottlenecks, and then all the way through to like a kind of outcome metric, which is like based around the quality of hire assessed against preventable churn. So there's a lot to consider there. Let's move on to the next topic, which we'll spend a few minutes on, but I think this might be useful for people in the audience around kind of common mistakes that you've seen recruitment teams make, or things that you might avoid when trying to think about metrics. Rack, I think when we spoke this before, it might come back to you. You spoke about kind of metrics that become challenging to measure as something that might be a mistake that make there. You mind maybe kicking us off with that, and then we'll move through it.
Yeah, I think a mistake could be sort of sometimes focusing too narrowly on metrics that maybe either hard to quantify. Like, and quality of hire is also one of those things. So you almost have to have like a mechanism and framework to sort of analyze that and sort of not making like your North Star metric. But I think another part of that as well is of course things like time to hire is like really, really important, but it shouldn't also be like your sole focus. So like if you prioritize speed without even assessing something like quality of hire, then the overall value of the process diminishes a little bit. And I think linked to that as well is sometimes you can get in a habit sometimes of reacting to limited data. So another common mistake is sort of reacting too quickly to a really small sample size of data points. So for example, a few bits of feedback from a few candidates of hires might push sort of talent teams to make unnecessary changes. And sometimes it's better to sort of rely on a broader scope and set of data so you can sort of avoid knee-jerk reactions as part of sort of the considered strategy as well. And I guess that ultimately is underpinned by like isolated metrics, sort of like and connecting them to the recruitment strategy as well.
Yeah, Luke, I can see you nodding on this one, so maybe we'll come over to you next.
Yeah, it's just some the Rack saying there, which resonates around sort of having a too small a data set and having sort of knee-jerk reactions. One of the things that recruiters actually aren't that good at is governance. They're really bad at governance and understanding sort of where are the roles and responsibilities, who's responsible, who's going to be accountable. It means it makes it difficult for us to properly communicate recruitment data to stakeholders. And I know that's kind of the next topic, not this one. But also when it comes to the smaller data set, how do you stop people who are in positions of authority demanding some kind of knee-jerk reaction that we know as recruiters isn't actually going to be particularly impactful? And then there's the question of, well, do we politically just do something that we know is going to be inefficient, or do we stand our ground? And if so, what data can we use to stand our ground? Which is why it's something that I think is very important, which is to ritualize like the continuous improvement. So not just what data we're going to show, but how we're going to show them. What's the template and what's the format? So, for instance, I'm a big advocate of quarterly retrospectives, where we essentially we use the same language and the same sort of agile methodology that our software development team would. At the end of every quarter, we look at a previous quarter's work in a very ritualized and structured way. It's ring-fence time that is strategic, so that the recruiters and the higher managers of that specific domain. So actually not just look at, are we going to give this person a job, or is this person a reject, or whatever, but more focused on the actual strategic sort of changes. And if there is something like, that requires a reaction, a knee-jerk reaction, or something bad happened, it can be brought up in a more controlled environment where everyone understands what the scope of the work is. And if it's a retrospective, it tends to be blame-free, very solutions-driven, rather than some immediate reaction to a bad candidate experience or something. So something like a 60 to 90 minute preso where we look at the top line data, highlights, lowlights. We look at the funnel data, compare it to the previous quarter, and then figure out, is there any specific area that we can definitely make a move on over the course of the next quarter. And then we can assign we can have a roundtable chat with everyone involved, including interviewers and whoever is there, come up with some specific solutions, and then assign an owner and govern it. It's really good for your team as well, from the recruiter's point of view, because you can give your recruiters stretch goals and say, right, well, Rack can be responsible for this improvement in tech screening. His idea was to shadow technical interviewers and have an interviewer shadow our sourcing sprints, and we'll create a feedback loop for technical information for our candidates at the top of the funnel. Okay, good idea, Rack. We think that might increase it by 5%. Brilliant. Right, now we can execute on that for the following quarter, and then the next quarter we have another retro, so we go round and round. It takes these very big goals that we have of double, triple, quadruple hires over the next scaling phase of, say, 4 years, turns it into something very bite-sized in particular. So I think that's one of the main ways I've found you can remove that sort of lack of governance and the problems that you get from these kind of bite-sized little knee-jerk reactions, and turn it into something a bit more strategic and a little bit more sort of controlled by TA.
Great, thanks, Luke. And Mike, finally, we'll come to you on this one. It might actually bring us full circle a little bit to some of the points you're making at the start. What common mistakes do you think that recruitment teams make or should avoid?
Yeah, and just to piggyback off Luke, I think those quarterly retrospectives are really important, and it reinforces the need for talent to have a seat at the table for senior leadership or the executive team, because certainly it's always helpful to do those retros and to sort of assess what went well, what could be improved. But when you're doing that and sharing that out with the decision makers in the organization, and they're seeing the unique challenges that talent has, whether it's things in the market or things that the company's doing that's being a barrier, it really helps surface and get quick action on those issues. And I think about the retros that I've done with our senior leadership team, and coming out of that conversation, we're able to make decisions on adjusting compensation bands or having a discussion around what does work-life balance actually mean here at Pinpoint, how we sort of share it with candidates versus experience. And you surface all these things that are going to be really impactful for the whole company. And so those retros are really important, but it really reinforces the point that the talent needs to have a seat at the table to be able to surface those, have those candid conversations, and then take quick action. I think on common mistakes, I think not forgetting about the sort of quote unquote smaller metrics. When I say smaller metrics, I just mean they're not talked a lot about. So we always talk about time to fill, headcount to plan, cost per hire, candidate NPS. All those things are super, super important, but it's the micro sort of metrics that are often the most telling into your process. One important one that we use here internally and for our customers is this sort of idea of pass-through rate, recruiter pass-through rate. So if the percentage of candidates that I send to the hiring manager that then make it past them. And so that's important because it's going to show you, it's going to be an indicator of the overall recruitment process, the alignment or lack of between the recruiter and the hiring manager, the quality of the initial screenings, and even the clarity of the job descriptions. And it's going to identify where there may need to be more alignment between the recruiter and the hiring manager. You may need to clarify things with the job descriptions. You may need to improve the initial candidate conversation. And so paying attention to those granular metrics is going to lead to a more efficient hiring process, a better candidate experience, and ultimately better, recruitment outcomes.
Awesome. Cheers, Mike. We actually just had a question come in on this topic, so I might bring it up now. I think I can add it to the stream now. How would you make the best of small data sets that might be misleading or perhaps are accurately inferring on issues? I'll open it up to anyone who might want to pick that up.
Yeah, I would say I think Rack earlier said not over-indexing on small data sets. Definitely don't over-index on it, but make a point of it, benchmark it, and continue to look at it, make a note to look at it again in 30, 45, 60 days. I also think looking at the data, and if there are really clear outliers, right? So if you come into a talent function and they've hired maybe 6 people over a year, and their time to fill is like 100 days, but you look at it, you can look at one role took on 200 days, or they never closed it in the ATS or something like that. Look for clear outliers, assess if that was sort of a blip or if it was something that's actually telling about your process or a specific department. But don't over-index it, but don't dismiss it either. Benchmark it, and then continually look at it on a cadence that makes sense for you.
Awesome. Cheers, Mike. So that brings us to about halfway through the webinar. I thought it might be interesting to quickly look at the poll as well, just to see where we're at on this. So it looks like time to hire and cost per hire and funnel conversion metrics are the most popular used metrics by the people in the audience, which is an interesting take considering what we've talked about so far around how you need a combination of all of those metrics typically to try and work out what's happening, not just depending on one, which may well be the case for a lot of people who are watching this. I'll also just quickly repoint everyone in the direction of the Q&A. Hopefully we'll have time to answer a few of these towards the end. So if anything comes up across the next half hour that you want to find out more about, please do chuck in a message. For the remainder of the webinar, we're going to cover 3 slightly smaller topics, but important topics. So we're going to talk about how metrics can be used to help with stakeholder buy-in, how they can be used in candidate experience, and how they can be used to help support your DE&I initiatives. So we'll kick off with the stakeholder buy-in, which I know everyone in this panel felt quite passionately about. So I'll open up that question and maybe go to Mike first. Back to you.
Yeah. And so in terms of getting stakeholder buy-in, it's sort of similar to what I said at the start with their priorities and work backwards. For example, if your company right now is emphasizing candidate experience, begin with metrics like candidate NPS or satisfaction scores, and then break down the components that contribute to that positive or negative experience, and sort of bringing them along that journey for them to understand what makes it to that end point. But to get buy-in, ultimately, it's crucial to improve your communication around the actual business. So you need to speak leadership's language, put yourself in their shoes, get as much business exposure as you can. Are their commercial plans viable in the context of the people and the pace that they tend to hire? Don't be content with just being an order taker and ask to hire X amount of people because someone just said so. You should ask the right questions of every leader in the business, such as how much the company needs to invest in hiring to reach its actual revenue objectives. I think talent leaders should speak up when things are off track. This is how you're going to show influence and over the business and build your credibility. And you want to communicate around the business to make sure people are actually utilizing your recruitment tech stack correctly, and making me clear on what the hiring manager ask is or the interviewer's asks are, so that the data is living in one place and is actually meaningful and actionable. So the approach will allow you to build hopefully a compelling narrative when you're requesting resources, whether it's additional headcount, new software, or just general budget increases. And by aligning that data with your stakeholders' priorities, you can actually demonstrate the value and necessity of your proposals.
Awesome. Cheers, Mike. Luke, I can see you nodding here because I know from having spoken to you before there's similar.
Yeah, I feel like Mike's in my mind. No, it's a great answer. I agree. Like what you were saying around the understanding that the TA in relation to the business goals really is key. I think one of the problems that a lot of recruiters face is that we could have stakeholders who are managers of a team of 6 who just need their goals met immediately, and it is a matter of headcount, and they may have their own latitude and views when it comes to quality. Elon Musk syndrome, so I like to call it. Someone wants best for nothing. Right the way up to the CEO and even your investors. So one of the things I think is important to help you as a recruiter or recruitment leader is to find what is the linear thread from your goals all the way through to the end business goal. Because if you do need to push back on maybe one of those stakeholders who are very, very focused on their own team, are their needs outlining or misaligned with the business goal? So it's really, really important to understand that. Also helps you, if you're a team leader, give non-arbitrary metrics to your recruiters as well. If they can see their individual work going right the way through, all the way through to the actual business vision and business goal. Very, very valuable, particularly if you use OKR, you can literally see it in to Atlantis or something like that. So yeah, making sure that you align the business goal. Also understand your stakeholders' responsibilities in relation to the wider business. So again, governance, who's responsible for what, who's accountable for what, who should be consulted, who should be informed. And if you don't know that, maybe even sit down and write a RACI chart, which literally charts it out with your stakeholders during a requirement gathering session or a kickoff call or whatever you want to call it. I'll not call it an intake call because that makes me feel sick, but a requirement gathering session or something like that. And then understand that your recruitment data makes sense to you because it is relevant to you. That isn't necessarily the case with your stakeholders. So let's look at a conversion again, just because it's an easy metric for us to talk about. You may want to increase conversion at a tech stage by 10%, or you may think that it's too low. How do you know that a hiring manager doesn't think that's a good thing? You're making an underlying assumption that they understand that. I've had a hiring manager said, "Oh, that just proves that we only hire the best." Of course, that's absolute nonsense. That doesn't prove that at all. But that could be the underlying assumption, and it's our fault for making the assumption that they would understand the value of that increase in conversion. But if you can say to that same person, you want to make 25 hires, maybe 2 feature teams plus some project managers over the next 6 months for your team, and if we increase conversion by 10% over those 25 hires, we can give you back 60 hours of engineering time in interviews that your teams didn't have to do. That's a feature met on time. That's their budget. That's stuff that really does rely to them. And the beauty of that is you can turn those funnel metrics into a forecast of the level of effort. You can model it out. You can say 1 hire based on our historical conversions means 1.2 offers, which means 2.5 final interviews, which means 4 tech interviews, all the way up. And you can plan, the velocity of the hire overall, individual recruiters' time and effort, if you need external support, and of course, what areas you should focus on to reduce the level of effort. So, try to think about the time and the money and the goals of that individual stakeholder, and translate your recruitment metrics not into some arbitrary number like a 10% increase in conversion, but something like a reduction of 50 engineering hours for every 25 hires. If I was an engineering manager, that's something that would move the needle with me, right, and make me listen. I'd recommend trying to visualize data where possible and create mock-ups. So again, if you're asking for a change, it's a risk to reward, right? Everyone's going to do a risk to reward ratio in their head. So if you're proposing a change that they can't visualize, but they're very good at visualizing cost in terms of their time, it's going to be a no, right? Because they can see the risk, but they can't see the reward. So wherever you can, maybe get used to using the business intelligence tools, free ones like Power BI or Tableau or Looker, and create mock-ups to show the potential future state if they say yes to this change. And then lastly, I already said, but just to I think it does fit within this bucket of creating continuous improvement rituals, because what this does is it trains your stakeholders into communicating with you in a specific ritualized way. So what I tend to find when I come into newer businesses, when a lot of change is happening, is you get a lot of these problems and a lot of stakeholders who maybe have their own views and whatnot, but once you actually set up these cycles of continuous improvement, they understand that if they do have a problem, they know the the format and the way to communicate with TA in the future. So it only takes about 6 months, these rituals to bed in, and then all of a sudden the relationships with stakeholders becomes much clearer, and the needs and the asks are much more unambiguous. So I definitely recommend sort of using continuous improvement sort of methodologies to just kind of control the narratives between you and your stakeholders.
Great. Cheers, Luke. So it feels like a kind of common theme coming up here, which is you need to speak the language of the stakeholders as a kind of primary, and then you need different ways of achieving that when you operationalize that, so that people believe what you're saying, you get buy-in for what you're saying, and they care about the things that you're talking about as well. Rak, do you have anything to add on that topic?
Not a great deal. I think they've both covered some really good points. But I think something we see at Zinc when we sort of have a bit more of a collaborative model as well, where sort of hiring managers are a bit of a shared responsibility in sort of hiring. I think using data as a proof to sort of align and sort of show that positive correlation between sort of the hiring manager involvement leads to better recruitment outcomes. So that can be things like helping crafting job descriptions, and also what's really important, kind of what Luke and Matt touched on, is that sort of feedback loop, giving really early feedback from sort of first stage interviews or the early stage candidates coming through, led to sort of faster hires of high quality candidates. So if you can say roles that marketing were heavily involved with were filled with sort of in 10 days with a high quality of candidates because they were more active in the role, where roles where hiring managers may be less involved took a bit longer, that's going to really, really help you get that buy-in, because everyone has that sort of care for quality of candidates and the time it's taking as well.
Awesome. Yeah, cheers, Rag. I guess it's a similar theme as well, isn't it? Just try and speak a language that they actually care about, and show them the results of the initiatives that you work through. Awesome. So I'll move on to the next topic, which is how we want to think about metrics when it relates to candidate experience. Mike, I know you guys pinpoint kind of, I guess, your product makes this really simple and possible, but also the way that you run it internally is using an NPS score as well, I think. So maybe you could kick us off with how you kind of measure and understand candidate experience.
Yeah, for sure. So I think improving candidate experience starts with collecting comprehensive feedback from candidates, and your ATS should be able to certainly do that, both in a numerical sort of assessment feeling, and then of course written form, so you get the context and allow that candidate to provide that feedback. It's crucial to not only just analyze this data sort of as a summary, but across dimensions. So we can look and pinpoint at the score by recruiting manager, by hiring manager, by department, by job level, and really specifically by which stage that they left our process in, right? So we can look at the score by people that applied and didn't get a phone screen, that got a phone screen, that made it through to certain stages, to offer, to hire, et cetera. And so having that information is going to allow you to identify specific areas of concern and variances across your organization. So if you receive feedback that the process was too slow, right, you can then go and take action and dive deeper. Things like average time spent in each stage, communication gaps between interviews, obviously your time to hire, and other relevant factors. And that analysis will allow you to really pinpoint exactly where improvements are needed and let you take targeted action to enhance the overall candidate experience. And like I said, a good ATS will make this a very light lift for you. I don't have to do anything. I've got my settings set up, and then I get instant insights that I can then dive into and share out with the team.
Great, thanks, Mike. Rak, I would be interested actually to go to you next, because I know Zinc have a way of kind of understanding this part of the process during like the onboarding experience as well, and candidate satisfaction and sentiment. So how do you see it from your point of view?
Very similar. I guess like how we see Zinc from a candidate perspective is almost the candidate's first impression of the onboarding experience for that respective business, right? Because typically background checks are done at offer stage at the very, very early start of the process. So what we've done is we've built into our platform sort of a candidate NPS, kind of similar to what Mike said, where candidates can sort of rate their experience of going through background screening sort of at the end of when the process is finished, right? But they can also leave sort of qualitative feedback through sentiment feedback as well, which we actually sort of repurpose and share with our sort of customers as well. And I think what's important as well is we also deal with sort of rechecking as well. So we have a lot of regulated markets where they do annual rescreening. And typically what we see is those that sort of have a negative sort of candidate experience, it typically sentiments like, why are you screening me again? What's going on? And it always highlights a lack of poor internal comms typically around sort of what you're doing sort of check. So it really highlights candidate expectations and aligning with them first before you do something like a background screening, because it can be quite daunting at first. So I think also doing that on the onboarding process is super important, but also it's a continuous thing you need to keep in mind as well, as like you manage an expectation early on, and also having that internal comms is a really big piece when it comes to candidate experience, especially from a background checking perspective, because it can sort of scare people if there's no prior warning to it as well.
Yeah, for sure. I guess I'll take from that of what you and both Mike have said there is that you should try and understand the candidate experience through this entire journey. You know, this isn't just from first interview to offer. It's from the very start of this process all the way to the very end when someone's at your company. And the more you can do to understand each stage of that feels like the more value you can add to the process.
Absolutely.
Luke.
Yes.
Over to you. I guess broadly on this question, is there anything else that you'd like to add, or another way that you can view this?
Yeah, I agree on kind of current state versus future state, and candidate NPS is just like the most simple and valuable way to do that. But firstly, I didn't know the Sync did that rescreen feature. That's a really cool idea. Well done, Sync. Yeah, I don't want to talk too much about candidate NPS, but I would say if you are a small business and you don't have anything in when it comes to candidate feedback, the best place to start is candidate NPS. Most ATSs have some kind of web form you can send, whether it's a pre-made NPS or not. And if you don't, also go and speak to your product team or your marketing team. They know how to do this with their customers and with their potential users. They're very sophisticated at this, so you can borrow from more sophisticated parts of your business. Or use a cool ATS like Pinpoint or Ashby, sorry, Mike, or Pinpoint to do this, because it looks like they have a pretty excellent functionality when it comes to that. A couple of things that haven't been discussed that is you can maybe spot in your own data is, Mike touched on it actually, which is measuring the sort of dropout versus rejection per stage. So if you can see like rough ratios between, like, imagine a stacked bar chart for every stage, like a little half funnel. If that is just a ratio of when they left us compared to when we left them, you can look at that overall conversion and decide, all right, is this a candidate experience issue, or is this a process issue, or a candidate quality issue? So you may find that common in, say, take-home tests and that maybe are a little bit unrealistic in terms of expectations on the candidate. Maybe you go in the wrong direction if there's a low conversion at that stage, thinking, oh, maybe the candidates aren't good enough to pass the screen. And in actual fact, if you look at that ratio broken down, actually most candidates are just dropping out the process at that stage because they don't want to do a 6-hour coding test or a 2-day long case study or whatever it's going to be. So I would say measuring the ratio of withdraw to reject at every stage is a really good overall bellwether, because if you see a sudden change in that ratio over time, that's an indicator. And then lastly, you can kind of use a mixture of sort of your funnel data and a bit of common sense as well. So there's a concept in Lean called whip limits, which is essentially just you've decided arbitrarily to put a number behind a queue. So let's say it's a tech interview, because that's just seems to be the example we've used. Let's say you know that candidates are going to get annoyed just by common sense if they have to wait too long for an interview, or maybe they cool down, and that reduces their buy-in throughout the remainder of the process. Then figure out however many candidates you can do in that 2-week period, and then whenever you reach that number, you stop recruiting for that role. You go and use your time elsewhere. And what that does is that manages those queues. So you can manage a lot of candidate experience by ensuring that no candidate gets a poor experience at a certain stage because of volume. And if anyone's like applied for a job in the past year and seen a message like, due to the volume of applications, we may not be able to reply to you. Well, that's them just excusing the bottleneck, isn't it? At the very top of their process, should be able to manage those things. So it is a poor experience. I think a lot of people who have been open to work in the past couple of years has probably had that impact. So maybe have a look at your stages, figure out what the width limits are to say what is the biggest queue before candidate experience diminishes, and then set those as width limits, and then manage your volume accordingly. And you may find that you knock out a lot of candidate experience problems just due to the operational, just due to volume and basic operational sort of problems.
Love it. Thanks, Luke. So kind of summary of that would be, just as a kind of absolute fundamental, you need to get something like candidate NPS in place, which is a pretty tried and tested process. But there are other things you can do within that: ratio, withdrawal, reject, and then also setting WIP limits, WIP limits, which should help prevent a lot of those issues that come up with candidates, which is typically the frustration of waiting a long time for feedback, getting into interview, and all of that. Love it. But we've got 10 minutes left, one more topic to cover, and the Q&A, which we'll leave 5 minutes for at the end. So if you've got any more questions, chuck them into the chat now. But we'll spend 5 minutes on how recruitment metrics can be used to help support DE&I initiatives. Mike, maybe we'll send this one in your direction to start with. That's okay?
Yeah, I think it's important to note is first to not overthink it. What I mean by that is having a good recruitment process broadly is going to inherently make your hiring more fair, consistent, inclusive, equitable. And this shows up by ensuring there is a tight job intake, there is clear rationale for moving candidates forward and out of the process, you're giving specific feedback when rejecting candidates, and you're using consistent sort of criteria and scorecards for helping you make data-informed hiring decisions. I think beyond that, teams should look then up the makeup of their application base. Are people from underrepresented, overlooked, and traditionally excluded groups applying? And if not, you need to review your job descriptions, the language you're using on the job description, the salary transparency, where you're posting jobs, where you're sourcing. Beyond that, you can examine your pass-through rate. So are candidates from these groups progressing through your process, or are they being excluded from the start? There are tools you can enable. Pinpoint has a blind hiring process, for example, or feature where you can evaluate candidates solely based skills on an experience, not pedigree, their name, their education, where they live. And then, of course, ultimately, you need to track who's making it through your process and who's being hired. I think a common mistake I see is a misalignment between talent and HR functions if they're separated, so recruiting and traditional HR. This can show up in a number of ways. So first is identifying who is actually underrepresented in your company. The phrase underrepresented has a very specific, or rather a broad meaning, but each company will have specific needs, whether it's the gender mix of your engineering team, the makeup of your senior leadership team, but you need to understand that to really start to put some goals together for your organization. I'd also say if you're prioritizing diversity in hiring, you need to make sure your team is committed and currently executing the I, the inclusivity. I've seen many times that companies want to have diversity initiatives, which is great, but they aren't maybe being honest about their ability to have a workplace that will let these individuals thrive and grow and be their genuine self in the organization. So again, it's why talent really needs to have a seat at the table and to be engaged in these types of conversations and to really be meaningful when you're thinking about DEI, but also know that a good process is inherently going to make have fair and equitable hiring outcomes.
I'd agree with that. I just want to jump straight in. So I just heartily agree with that. I think evidence-based success criteria is so important, not for any process, for a good process, but of course, to ensure that conscious biases aren't impacting decisions. What's also important is the success criteria being documented correctly as well. So let's say you have evidence-based questions. Interpretation is still subjective. So like a red, amber, green status, for example, of questions or answers that would fail to meet and exceed those criteria is also a good way of helping a large body of interviewers make relatively consistent decisions and consistent interviewer training as well. So they're using what's been documented. And I believe, I don't know if Pinpoint has it, but that documentation can live inside the ATS when it's from interview to interview, to ensure that they're using that instead of maybe subjective biases, even if it's seen as positive biases within the interviews. There's also obviously an opportunity to use your data to look for areas where you can find people from different people with diversity of thought, often from less represented backgrounds. But I think there's often survivorship bias there as well. So I've been in organizations where we found there was a push for female engineers, and they found a lot of female engineers in India, and they were in a global company, so they doubled down in India. Now that's I would say that was something you could do to find more engineers for your business, find places where there are more female engineers. but there's a level of survivorship bias there, right? What about the places? Why are we not finding female engineers in the UK? Why are we not finding female engineers in Italy and all the other global places, right? So we have to be mindful that when we look at our data, that there is an element of our own element of survivorship bias, because let's say we have a goal for more female engineers. The quickest way to do that is to just hire all the female engineers in India, and we don't end up with a business that is diverse of thought just by location barriers. It's also important to challenge any arbitrary goals for underrepresented groups, so you're not in a situation where someone can essentially cook the books. So we have a male-dominated sales team and a female-dominated marketing team. Well, let's just call it sales and marketing, and then let the averages do the rest. I'm sorry, that's nothing to do with diversity. That's covering two very undiverse groups within your business. So it's important to actually properly challenge it, as Mike very rightly says, the I in inclusivity, which I think is a good way to put it. Of let's actually challenge ourselves. Like, where are we suffering from a lack of diversity of thought in our business? What is the impact of that? The negative impact to the bottom line when it comes to developing products and services, and go from there. And yeah, you can track funnel data to see where you're finding people from different backgrounds and so on. But lastly, I just want to say that the best way to look at DE&I, I found, is to actually look at it as a community and not a marketplace. So look at areas where you can act. If you set a KPI based on engagement with the community, it's very hard to over-index on that. If you speak to a certain amount of people from a certain community, like women in STEM groups in universities, female leadership communities online and in person, people from code clans rather than top universities, things like this, then there's no real downside to getting involved in those communities. You just have to measure it based on how much you can give to those communities, and of course that's good for your employer brand. And then lastly, challenging. This is particularly for venture-backed businesses. It's very common for venture-backed businesses to see logos, company logos, and educational backgrounds as like a rough proxy for quality when it comes to investing in businesses. And that can cause a significant series of biases at the leadership level, because they want that person who was the staff engineer at Google who left to join your startup, or you want that person who was top of their class at MIT to, why did they join your startup and not the others? And it's important to ensure that as a TA leader, you're challenging those initial thoughts and goals, because if that trickles down into the wider leadership of your business, you end up with a very sort of elitist mentality that may actually actively exclude people from lower economic backgrounds and various other places.
Awesome. Thank you, Luke. I think that brings us roughly to the end of the set questions. We've got a couple of minutes left, so we'll just do some quick fires from the Q&A, if that's okay. Mike, one directly for you. Is Recruiter pass-through rate a metric that's available in the Pinpoint ATS Insights suite?
Yes, in our Insights Hub it is, yeah.
Awesome, thank you. The question to anyone, does anyone use self-assessment or self-select processes for candidates to progress through the hiring process, whether or not this is done async or at scale? Does anyone have any experience in that, or if not, we can go on to the next question.
Is it like one-way video interviewing or actual like standardized assessments,
Craig, if you're still with us and want to clarify that at all, then feel free to chuck it in. I think we just have one more question. So if, say, a hiring target start dates was 6 to 8 weeks from the jobs going live, allowing for notice periods, and a firm that has standard 2 to 3 stage interview process, how can TAs highlight capacity before it becomes a problem, rather than when it becomes a problem? Mike, you're nodding. Do you want to?
Yeah, I would just say I know we're close to time, as best as you can, doing an annual headcount planning process. So looking at the forecasting a budget for the year, figuring out when those people are in seat, and you should have a sort of recruiter productivity model. So here it's going to be different for every company. We look at how much time it takes me to fill a role, how much time it is for a hiring manager, everything from sort of intake, job description, sourcing, interviewing, all the way to offer negotiation and hiring. And so we put that sort of model together, and we look at the number of roles, we look at how we're going to hire over the quarter, and we apply that model and see in the red sort of where there's going to be additional support, whether we're going to engage a contractor, hire another recruiter, use an agency for some of those. So you want to identify first those time points. You can understand how much of your time it takes for a particular role, and then apply that as best you can. And then of course, build in attrition, look at your last year's attrition, and then build in that you're going to have to hire backfills along the way. Awesome.
Thanks, Mike. And that takes us just over time. So I'll just quickly say thanks so much to Luke, Mike, and Rack for joining us. That's super interesting. For anyone who's still with us, the recording will be sent out a couple of hours after this. So if you missed any of it, you'll be able to catch up there. So yeah, thanks to everyone. I hope you enjoyed it.
Thanks all.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah.